Hey everyone, get ready for a deep dive into something, well, something we all do, but don't always think about how we learn to speak.
It is pretty amazing when you stop and consider it. I mean, we start as babies, right? Communicating with, cries and coos.
Right.
And then fast forward a few years, and we're fluent in these crazy, complex systems languages.
It really is mind-blowing, and that's what we're getting into today, language acquisition. Specifically, those early years when kids go from, like, babbling to actual sentences.
Yeah.
How does that even happen?
Yeah, the how is key. And trust me, it's a lot more complicated and interesting than it might seem.
Way more controversial than you'd think, too. So, to really dig into this, we're looking at some fascinating research. It centers on two big theories, behaviorism and innatism. But even before we get into the weeds, when you think about those early stages of language development, what's something that really stands out to you? Like, what's particularly puzzling or even just impressive about how kids learn language?
Well, for me, it's always been the sheer speed and the complexity of it all. I mean, you've got these little kids, right? They're basically deciphering a code.
With no instruction manual.
Exactly. It's not like we sit them down with grammar books right from birth. Yet they figure it out, the grammar, the syntax, even, when to use certain words or phrases in different situations. It's like incredible.
It's like they're mini linguists running around testing out their theories.
Exactly.
And speaking of theories, let's talk about that first one, behaviorism, which on the surface seems to make sense, right?
Right, because at first glance, it does seem like kids are just copying what they hear around them.
Mimicking, yeah.
And this is where B.F. Skinner comes in. He was all about behaviorism, argued that language learning, it's all about conditioning, just like you'd train, say, a dog.
Okay, so rewarding them with a treat when they sit.
Exactly. But, and here's the thing, language is way, way more nuanced than that.
Right, like infinitely more.
Right. And that's where behaviorism, it kind of hits a wall. Like, sure, imitation and reinforcement, they're part of it, especially early on. But can they really explain everything about how kids learn something as complex and subtle as language?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's not just about kids, like parroting back what they hear, what else is going on, I mean, the research actually gives us some pretty funny clues about this. It talks about this whole thing of rule creation in how kids use language.
It is fascinating. Like, they're not just mimicking, they're little scientists or something trying to figure out the rules of the language. And of course, in that process, you get these adorable, totally grammatically wrong versions of sentences and words.
Totally. Like, they have a theory about how grammar works,
Right.
and they're testing it out.
Yes. And those errors, they actually tell us a lot. They're like evidence that kids are building their own understanding of these language rules. They're not just repeating what they hear.
Right, right. Yeah, and the research gives this great example about this. There's this kid, Randall, and when he was 36 months old, get this, he invented the verb to dock. So his mom was talking about taking him to the doctor, and Randall asks, why? So he can dock my little bump.
It's brilliant. He just took the noun doctor and turned it into a verb. And what's so telling is that no one had ever said to dock around him, which means he was applying some kind of internal logic to language.
It's like he understood that can mean someone doing something, like a teacher who teaches.
Yeah.
So doctor must dock.
Exactly. And it's not just Randall. The research also talks about this 5-year-old David who was at his sister's birthday party. And they were doing that whole toast thing, but with grape juice. And, well, after everyone raises their glasses, David, he proudly says, I want to propose a piece of bread.
Oh, no. He got the event mixed up with toast the bread.
Exactly. But it's these kinds of mix-ups that are so important for understanding language development.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's hilarious, but also kind of amazing, to see how his brain is working.
It really is, because if kids were only learning language through imitation, we wouldn't see these kinds of creative errors, right? These moments where they're clearly trying to apply rules, even if they get them a little mixed up.
That's a really good point. So if behaviorism can't explain everything, like these leaps in kids' language, what can? What else is there?
Okay, so this is where we get into innatism. And when we talk about innatism, we have to talk about Noam Chomsky. Chomsky, he's a linguist who kind of turned the field upside down with his ideas. And he argued that behaviorism, it just couldn't explain how quickly and how completely kids learn language. It had to be something else, something innate, something we're born with.
So not a blank slate, but like we have some kind of head start when it comes to language.
Exactly. Chomsky, he proposed this idea of universal grammar. It's this set of principles that are common to all languages. So it's like we're born with this blueprint in our brains no matter what language we end up speaking.
Okay, so how does that actually work in real life? I mean, babies aren't born reciting Shakespeare or anything.
Right. Think about it like this. Imagine you're trying to, like, build some complicated piece of furniture, but there's no instructions. Could you do it?
I can barely do it with instructions.
Right. But what if you at least had some basic idea, some intuition about how the pieces usually fit together? That's kind of what universal grammar does for language. It's this framework that helps kids make sense of the language they hear and learn their native language's specific rules.
So, like, even before they know actual words, their brains kind of already get how sentences work or how verbs and nouns go together.
Exactly. And here's the thing. Chomsky argued that this ability, this language instinct, it's unique to humans. It's a big part of what makes us different from other species.
So we've got this, like, language starter kit built right in. No wonder kids pick up language so fast, even if it's not always, grammatically perfect.
Exactly. And it makes you think about like those reflexive pronouns, right? Like himself, herself. Even for us, those rules, they're so ingrained. We just know what sounds right, even if we can't explain the actual grammar rule.
Totally. Like, no one ever sat me down and was like, you cannot say himself watched him. But it just sounds wrong.
Right. And those kind of rules, the ones we just use without thinking, I mean, they really show how powerful that universal grammar idea is. Like some things about language are so basic, so like deeply a part of how our brains work that they're almost instinct.
That's wild. But okay, so if we're hardwired for language, does that mean, like, the environment doesn't matter? Could we just stick a baby in a room with language tapes and they'd, like, magically become fluent?
That's a really interesting question, and it actually brings up a really important point, something that the research touches on too, called the interactional or developmental perspective. See, even though Chomsky's ideas about innatism, they were huge, they don't explain everything about how kids learn language.
So it's not just nature or our nurture, but both.
Exactly. This other perspective, it says that, yeah, we might be born with this, like, ability, this predisposition for language, but the environment we grow up in, it really shapes how that ability actually develops. It's like, think of a seed. The seed has the potential to become a plant, but it needs the right stuff to actually grow, right? Like
Yeah.
soil and sunlight and water.
So our brains are prepped for language, but we need actual interaction, real conversations to really make it all come together.
Right. Think about how parents and caregivers, they naturally do all this stuff to help kids learn language even without realizing it. Singing songs, reading books, having back and forth, even just like talking about what they're doing every day. All of that gives kids the input, the information they need to actually become speakers.
It makes you realize how important both sides of it are. We've got the blueprint, but we need the right environment to build it all.
It's this fascinating dance between our nature, our biology, and the nurture we get from the people around us.
It's amazing, really. And we've just scratched the surface here. But it's clear that, I don't know, figuring out how we learn language, it tells us so much about what makes us human, about how incredible our brains are.
Absolutely.
It really has been a fascinating deep dive. So next time you hear a kid saying something, grammatically creative,
Yeah.
don't just chuckle. Take a second to appreciate what's actually happening in their brains. They're not just learning to talk. They're like cracking a code, testing out theories, figure out this whole language thing in their own way. And that's pretty amazing. Until next time, keep your ears open, keep asking questions, because you never know what you might discover.